Today, the U.S. Secretary of State put Syrian chemical weapons, the Russian military, and a Nazi atrocity all in this same headspace. Is this the road to peace or directions into a diplomatic dead end? I'm Brent Goff, and this is The Day.
We remember the events of August 12, 1944 that occurred in Santana, and we rededicate ourselves to holding to account any and all who commit crimes against the innocents anywhere in the world. This place will serve as an inspiration to us all.
I believe that Russia knew about the chemical weapons because they were operating from exactly the same base.
With the best will in the world, it is the Americans who have changed the game. The message that we're sending to the Russians is very, very clear. Do they want to be eternally associated with a guy who gasses his own people?
Well, welcome to the program, everyone. We begin the day with much of the world in agreement. Syrian President Bashar al-Assad has to go before peace can come to stay. But the Russian reality in Syria continues to stand in the way. Can American diplomacy move Moscow? Well, that is what G7 foreign ministers meeting in Italy would like to know. Our support is almost global for that U.S. cruise missile bombing in retaliation of last week's suspected chemical weapons attack in Syria. A world almost united in its outrage over Syria. Now, this does not happen often. Neither do the U.S. accusations of war crimes committed by Russia that we are hearing from the U.S. Congress. In all of this, the U.S. Secretary of State is supposed to find the right diplomatic tone to convince Vladimir Putin that Bashar al-Assad must be contained until he is history. We begin tonight with this report.
The misery doesn't let up in this refugee camp. For the millions of Syrian refugees scattered across the globe, last week's chemical attack in their homeland refocused the world's attention again on this brutal conflict. It's also stolen the focus of a meeting of G7 foreign ministers in Italy, with renewed efforts to end the bloodshed. Just before the talks, the US hinted it may once again take up the mantle of the world's policeman after giving mixed signals over its Syria policy.
And we rededicate ourselves to holding to account any and all who commit crimes against the innocents anywhere in the world.
It comes just days after Washington attacked a Syrian airbase in response to the suspected gas attack it blames on Syrian President Bashar al-Assad. Britain is also calling for Russia to end its support for the Syrian government.
And the message that we're sending to the Russians is very, very clear. Do they want to stick with a toxic regime? Do they want to be eternally associated with a guy who gasses his own people? Or do they want to work with the Americans and the rest of the G7 and indeed the like-minded countries for a new future for Syria?
But will Russia take heed? Moscow has warned that the US airstrike violated international law. Tillerson flies to Russia after the G7 meeting. It'll be an early test of whether the US can use any momentum generated by the Syrian strike and find a way to end the conflict.
All right, let's pull in our correspondent, Barbara Vazel. She is covering that meeting in Lucca, Italy. Good evening to you, Barbara. So we've got U.S. Secretary of State Tillerson saying that the United States will not allow crimes against the innocents anywhere in the world to go unpunished. Now, interesting, he says anywhere in the world. Now, this sounds like an America accepting its role as a global policeman again, is it?
It sounds like a complete political somersault backwards, or an about turn, or whatever phrase we might find for it. And the problem is that there's only one representative of the U.S. government who has come out with really a strong commitment like this, and a political explanation that sort of what means Washington is what it was before. We heard here in Lucca at the beginning of the talks, the Italian Foreign Minister Angelino Alfano rejoice in refinding the harmony with the United United States. So we don't know yet what it means, how durable this is, and whether the whole Trump administration is behind the statements of Tillerson or not.
Yeah, and today the British Foreign Minister Boris Johnson proposed new sanctions on Russia. How likely is that to gain support?
It is possible, of course, because everybody here, also the other European foreign ministers and Canada and, of course, the Japanese, who are with everybody here at the table, they want to increase pressure on Russia. However, the question is whether further sanctions, which mean probably sanctions against top military personnel in Russia or further sanctions against cronies of President Putin, will really change his mind. He has weathered the rather tough economic sanctions the EU has put against him since the Ukraine crisis rather well. So are further measures really going to change anything in Moscow? Will he feel that pressure, or will it make him even more stubborn? That also is anybody's guess.
Yeah, and G7 countries, they appear to have no clear position on Syria and Russia. They all agree that Assad needs to go, but when it comes to Syria as a whole and Russia, there is really no unity. How big of a problem is that?
It is a big problem, of course, because what everybody fears is sort of an accidental escalation of the conflict. Now, all the Europeans are quite clear, and particularly Germany and France, they don't want any military escalation. They would not be at the side of the United States if they decided to sort of go further into the country and come out with further airstrikes or other strikes against the Assad regime. They want a political solution. However, what is not clear is how that can be brought about. At the moment, everybody says we need to put more pressure on Russia. However, is that going to work? Again, we don't know this. During the past years, it hasn't worked. It hasn't changed Putin's mind. So it's not clear. The hardline talk we hear now from Rex Tillerson is the one side, sanctions from Boris Johnson are the other side, and the caution on the German side is sort of the third piece of the triangle here. And there is no real unified position.
All right, our correspondent Barbara Vasil on the story for us tonight in Lucca, Italy, where that G7 meeting is taking place. Barbara, thank you very much. Well, U.S. President Donald Trump, he is well known for his Twitter diplomacy. Instead of taking the official way, he often prefers using social media to directly address the people. And apparently the Russians are taking a page from Trump's guidebook to tweets of public diplomacy. Now consider this, the Russian embassy in Britain came down hard on UK Foreign Minister Boris Johnson after he decided to cancel his trip to Moscow last Friday. It is deplorable, they wrote. They tweeted that Boris Johnson found himself unfit to stand Western ground on Syria in bilateral talks with Sergei Lavrov. That's the Russian foreign minister. Now, the embassy also posted this poll on Twitter asking people, if G7 ultimatum to Russia brings us to real war, what is your trust in Donald Trump as a wartime leader and Boris Johnson as his lieutenant? And as you can see, almost, 60% said that they were appalled. Of course, this poll is not scientific, and we do not know who voted. And then today, as the G7 foreign ministers gathered in Italy, the Russian embassy revealed its true feelings about Russia no longer being invited. It is sheer lunacy to believe that sovereign and independent Russia wishes to return to the U.S. G7 prison.